Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Professor Anarita Bashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program professor, I'm actual program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Professor Katerina Shrey, and she will introduce our guest today. Thank you.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to welcome back to our program today Dr. Mark Thomas. Dr. Mark Thomas is currently an assistant professor and chair of political science at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, where he is much loved by students and colleagues and mentors alike. His areas of expertise include the politics of Central East Europe, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation, and U.S. national security affairs and cyber policy. Mark is also a decorated veteran and a senior intelligence analyst with over 20 years of experience identifying critical security shortcomings and offering strategic advice to the upper levels of the military. We are so lucky to have him. We welcome back to the program today, and today he will speak to us on Russian war crimes and international law. Welcome, Dr. Thomas. Hello.
Hello, thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure, and I'm always very proud of what Marshall's doing. It's amazing, such a small university is able to make such a big impact. So today we're going to talk about war crimes in the war in Ukraine and Russia's war on Ukraine. And I want to kind of start off with some basic ideas of what we're talking about, and then everything that you see or hear regarding an incident, you then can be the judge of whether it amounts to a war crime, whether it moves up from war crime to crime against humanity, or ultimately to genocide. Some general guidelines when it comes to the law of armed conflict, which is no longer called the law of war because in 1977 several countries signed the Treaty of Rome, or the Rome Statutes, which extends what is then called the law of war out to civil wars, etc., and how to protect. And really the focus was how to protect civilians, not just combatants. I'll make a difference between non-combatants and combatants. So one of the first things we have to understand is what is a combatant versus a non-combatant. And the additional protocols, additional protocol 1 and 2, kind of spell that out. But just so background, we have 4 Geneva Conventions, all signed in about 1949, which really dealt with what we consider laws of war, how to treat POWs, what to do with injured, treatment of Red Cross, protected sites, etc., which you couldn't do during an interstate war. The additional protocols come about in 1977, and they're designed to help differentiate based on what happened in Vietnam, how to differentiate guerrillas or freedom fighters, however you want to view them, as those within the civilian population. So we're not a non-combatant is not necessarily a civilian, as we read the additional protocols. A non-combatant is one who doesn't carry arms and is not engaged in combat, and will bring the additional protocols in. They're also the ones that theoretically a freedom fighter / guerrilla could be carrying a weapon and still be a combatant. So as long as you're not engaged in combat or about to plan combat, you're considered a non-combatant. Civilians are a section of non-combatants, but they're not the only type. Combatants are anybody who carries a weapon or plans to carry a weapon. That's the easy definition. Then we think about if you have people that are protected, you also have locations that are protected. And we have what are called protected locations, which are things like hospitals, museums, historical sites, religious sites, what else? Schools, any place, medical sites, medical tents, etc. Anything not dealing directly with combat, which have for some reason some degree of reason that beyond the role of combat. Just a protected site can become a justifiable target if a military force occupies location or uses it as from which to launch attacks. That becomes very problematic when we look at what we consider some of the war crimes coming out of Ukraine, the war on Ukraine. But before we get to specific incidents, and the number, I think CNN had counted 1,000 as of 2 years ago, what could amount to war crimes. That number has multiplied exponentially over the years. So it's difficult to tell you how many incidents are out there that could amount to a war crime. I'll differentiate between war crimes and then crimes against humanity in a second. There are 4 basic principles which kind of guide the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols there too. One is before you can use military force or armed force against anybody, there's got to be a reason, or what we call military necessity, to use that force. And the military necessity isn't to destroy the enemy, it's to whatever it would take to get him to surrender. And I'll keep this in the masculine gender, get him to surrender or to reduce their will to fight. So that doesn't mean you have to destroy the enemy, it just means you have to reduce their will to fight and push them towards surrender. The second principle, which overrides all of the conventions, is proportionality. That even if you have a site that you really will help bring the enemy to surrender, you can only use the amount of force necessary and proportional to making that surrender happen. And the traditional example is if you have a sniper in the belfry of a church, which by the way, the church would have been a protected site had the sniper not gone up there, you don't use a piece of field artillery to blow them out of the belfry. There are other ways of doing it. Whatever it takes to bring that soldier down, it has to be proportional to the amount of what the threat the enemy poses. So proportionality. The other one is you have to be able to discriminate between who's a combatant and who's a non-combatant. And that also means discriminate between sites that are used by the military and sites that are not used by the military, sites that are used by combatants, and those used only by non-combatants. So when in targeting, even if you have something in sight that you think would be useful to the enemy, you can't destroy it or injure it if it's not military necessity and if it's not used by combatants. Now, the definition of what is used by combatants gets stretched very much during this war on Ukraine. So we can go into that when we talk about the different types of crimes that have come up. The other thing that we think about is if you've met the other 3 general principles, it's military necessary to destroy, the force you're use is proportional to the target that you're going to destroy or bring to surrender. You've discriminated between non-combatants and combatants. The 4th principle is whatever force you use has to be humane. You'll think, well, bullets are by no means humane. Well, if you want to understand humanity is not inflicting unnecessary suffering, that's probably the easiest way of thinking about it. So you don't want to use, and we've banned certain weapons over the years, things like flamethrowers, cluster munitions are supposed to be banned, phosphorus grenades, phosphorus bombs, things which cause, after the initial hit, cause undue suffering. even to a legitimate target. So you can't use a phosphorus grenade on a soldier because phosphorus, when it hits your skin, it doesn't go out, not even with water. You need something special to put it out. Cluster munitions, because just by the very nature do, they aren't cause unnecessary damage. They don't discriminate. There's a series of things that any one violation of a principle could amount to a war crime. So when we think about what's been going on over the past few years, we have several things that we can talk about. One is how the Russians have treated combatants after they have put down their arms or injured. And not to be too philosophical about this, we can take this all the way back to Rousseau, who said that left to our own devices, we as human beings are very peaceful folks, but when we become a tool of the state, we then become a soldier, a government civilian, and we come, not to say government civilians are legitimate targets, but as a soldier, you're not an individual anymore, you're a tool of the state. However, when you cease to be able to fight or you cease fighting, you're considered out of combat. We're no longer hors de combat. And which means that you get the protections of a non-combatant and as a civilian. So if you surrender or you're injured, you're considered out of combat, you're no longer a tool of the state. At that point, you get all the humane protections that a normal person would get. You deserve treatment, fair treatment in hospitals, you deserve access to sending letters home, access to good clothing, good housing, fair treatment. The articles also specify that if a woman is caught in combat, or as a female soldier, she, as a POW, gets treatment appropriate to her gender. So anything that violates her person, for that matter, if it's a male tax and violates his person, violates his dignity, mental or physical, amounts to a war crime. And again, we'll talk about war crime, vice crime against humanity. So if it violates personal space, personal dignity, you aren't providing enough access to Red Cross or Red Crescent or the Red Diamond or Red Crystal, you are in danger of violating the basic ideas within the Geneva Convention. Now, above and beyond how you treat the POWs or those who are out of combat, we also think about what has occurred over the past few years about bombing of cities and bombing of critical infrastructure, and whether those amount to a war crime. And this is where we consider we're in that zone where when it comes down to if it ever gets to prosecution and gathering evidence, whether Kiev is necessary to the war effort. If you consider that Kiev is necessary to the war effort, there should be, again, think about this, say Kiev is necessary to the Ukraine war effort and Russia decides Kiev needs to be destroyed or pushed to surrender. You apply the next principles, which is proportionality and discrimination and humaneness. So again, remember, all four principles have to be met for anything not to amount to a war crime. So attacking like the Lavra would definitely be out. It's a protected site. Now, taking out one of the basilicas or cathedrals, definitely a war crime. Taking out a museum, definitely a war crime. Well, what if I were to take out the water supply to Kiev? Well, is that enough to bring it to surrender? Well, absolutely. But is it causing unnecessary damage to civilians who aren't involved in the combat? So you're hurting non-combatants. Taking out the railroad tracks. Well, you could say the railroad tracks are necessary to supply the Ukrainian troops at the front with weaponry. If the Russians can take out the railroad tracks with proportional force, take out just a railroad track. Excuse me a second. Take out the railroad tracks just by themselves, without damaging civilian infrastructure, you're probably within a fair zone. The trick in all of this is just that, is that these attacks, when they're done, do more than just hurt the military force. They actually end up hurting the civilian population's ability to feed itself or to supply itself. One of the examples we thought about, especially as winter approaches, is taking out the energy supply to a large city, which would then essentially put that city in danger, the population at least, of possibly freezing to death, which then would amount to, it goes from just a simple act of trying to take out Kiev as a valuable target, but it moves to the line of, are we causing unnecessary suffering? And is it a policy? And this is where we rise to the crime against humanity. Is it directed against civilians? And for something to be a crime against humanity, and let me step back here and say crime against humanity has really two big conditions. First, it's directed against civilians. And the second condition is it's either systematic or it is widespread. Widespread can mean geographically widespread, or widespread in the sense it's a geographically concentrated area with a large population. So urban areas counts as widespread. It may not be that geographically spread out, but it is concentrated. And there's an or to that too, or it can be systematic. In other words, it's not an accidental targeting, it's planned, it's part of the policy. At that point, when you've met those two conditions, it's targeting civilians, and the other legal condition, it's either systematic or it is widespread. Both of those amount to a crime against humanity. And we throw into that category things like deportations, mass executions, forced disappearances. Apartheid now falls under that category. What else can we throw into that category? Sexual violence, all those type of things, which you think if it's systematic and widespread, we then amount to a crime against humanity. And that takes it to a whole new level of prosecution before the International Criminal Court. Now, genocide can also amount to, it is a type of crime against humanity. It's actually the most heinous crime among the crimes, again, a quintessential and most heinous act of crime against humanity. What makes something genocide is that it's directed at wiping out or obliterating a group which is either in whole or in part based on their nationality, their ethnicity, their race, or their religion. And that amounts to anything from killing to bodily harm, making conditions so that life can't be continued, or with the sense of making the condition so bad that they can't continue an existence of a whole group of people. I also throw into that category preventing births. And then finally, the one that got Putin and Bielorussia, which is forcibly transferring children away from their families to another family. Now, naturally, it's possible to relocate children from a war zone. It's actually humane to do that. But under Geneva Conventions, if you're going to remove children from a war zone, first condition is you need to have permission of the parents or the guardian or whoever has custody of the child. Second of all, the person receiving them has to note the child's name, age, where it was picked up, where it's going, and register the child with the Red Cross. And then create all the conditions for that after the conflict is over, the child can be repatriated home. Well, the incidents involving, I think we're up to close to 500,000 or 700,000 Ukrainian children, don't meet any of those conditions. And we're approaching that point where just the incidents involving the children are pushing us up close to what we promised we'd avoid when World War II ended, getting close to a mass genocide. One of my, not so pet peeves is when I go to the Holocaust Museum, is looking at all the genocides that have occurred since the end of World War II. And embarrassingly for humanity, it fills up almost half a wall. And that's a great problem. Now, we can go back then and think about what amounts to, or some of the actual incidents. So I was talking with somebody recently about the destruction of a hydroelectric dam. And the hydroelectric dam actually, and this when we talk about evidence, allegedly Russian Ukrainian forces were trading control of the dam, and the dam was a strategic target for the Russians, so they destroyed it. We can say, well, did it meet any of the four conditions that we had talked about earlier? Was it of military necessity? Was the force proportional? And we have to think that the dam, blowing up the dam, actually caused significant harm beyond and beyond. So it's disproportionate to what was necessary to neutralize it as a useful tool for the Ukrainian forces if they were actually in the area. And the after effects of destroying the dam was flooding and destruction of villages below it. So it goes beyond into now we're pushing a crime against humanity. So again, even that simple act, which could be justified depending how the evidence is presented, becomes really, truly problematic. So then we think about bombing of critical infrastructure and of electricity. And then we also have to consider different types of use of weapons that are being used as these crimes are going on. Again, the list of different types of incidents that have occurred around Ukraine during this war is innumerable. I can't even think. I think I once referred to it as if you're looking for a war crime, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's you can pull them out left and right with what's going on. By the way, the difference between a war crime, a crime against humanity, is war crimes are usually committed on a small scale basis, either individually or by a unit. So if what happened with Lieutenant Calley in Vietnam was a unit action, it's a war crime. If it's directed by, back then, Westmoreland, it amounted to crime against humanity, especially if it's widespread and met the other things. So there are thresholds of what you can do. And that puts us at 25 after. If you guys have any questions, I'll gladly entertain questions, and that might be more interesting. And we can throw up different scenarios or different instances that you've heard of. We can go from there. So.
Well, let me start by saying thank you for basically a master class in key terms, concepts, and principles that we hear about all the time, but don't necessarily, think to pause to think of the distinction and of these things. So thank you. I mean, this is great. The proportionality, discrimination, humaneness. I believe there's a fourth element as well, you said, for for the Geneva Convention, do not cause unnecessary damage. Well, there were the four things: proportionality, discrimination, humaneness. What was the other one?
Military necessity.
Military necessity. Yeah. Thank you for identifying those protected locations, hospitals, schools, museums. I mean, I think we can all look back on events in the news where we even had a hospital with the big words "Getty children" spelled out, right? And we know that was targeted. Thank you for going with the difference between, I've got tons of notes here, combatants versus non-combatants, and then the rights of combatants when they become non-combatants. So this is incredibly useful, and I think is going to be very helpful as we continue to hear these terrible news, the terrible stories coming out of Ukraine. I'm wondering, this is, forgive the naivety of this question. So it looks like at one point the world came to its senses, came together and established what was, as horrible as it is to talk about war, established what was appropriate, what was tolerable maybe, right? And what was not. When something like, when a war crime happens, when something like this happens, and I know there is a physical court, but like, what level of blame is allocated at the unit level, at the higher structure level? I mean, all the way up to the top, right? I mean, how does this work? If Putin were to be brought to justice, what does that look like? How does that happen? How does that work? And I'm sorry for, I mean, that may be an incredibly naive question that even your
No,
students
no,
wouldn't
no.
have.
It's
So
actually a really
I
good.
know I'm not coming off particularly bright here, but I really seriously very much appreciate this like tour de force of concepts, terms, and principles that we just kind of talk about without necessarily understanding fully what they mean. So I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you. I felt a little bit out of place, but let's go to your question because it's actually really good. What all of the Geneva Conventions contain as if the country is willing to prosecute, say, I were to commit a war crime, my unit or my generals should prosecute me. For example, what happened in Abu Ghraib, obvious war crime, right? We prosecute those people within us. Had we not prosecuted, theoretically, had we signed up to the Rome statutes, they could have called us or could have called President Bush over to The Hague to be tried for a war crime.
Oh, wow.
So the country itself has responsibility to prosecute first. Now, if it's a policy, for example, Putin has a policy that he is a war criminal. And if it's widespread, we then go to crime against humanity. If it's, we keep moving up the scale. So if the country or the unit's willing to punish, that's fine. That meets the requirements because when you sign up to the conventions, it's essentially signing up to a treaty. You adopt it into your laws, statutes. It's actually, if we go back and look at the U.S. military, it's part of a uniform code of military justice. So you can be tried under our own laws for violating the Geneva Convention. Every country does that, and by the books, Russian has it in their books too.
Mm-hmm.
If one of Prigozhin's units committed a war crime, theoretically Putin could prosecute them. But if he doesn't, then he also bears the onus of guilt.
So thank you. Two more questions kind of building off of that. Again, I apologize for this being a naive question. Are all countries on the planet bound by the Geneva Conventions?
Most countries are.
Does he have to agree to be bound by them for?
Yeah. Absolutely. And it depends how you adopt them as your country. Naturally, U.S. State Department president negotiates it, gets ratified by the Senate, then it becomes part of our laws. Every country has some way of ratifying what's negotiated by their executive branch.
Thank you.
Now, for what it's worth, we are not party to the International Criminal Court because in our Senate's mind's eye, it violates our sovereignty to try somebody outside of the U.S. It violates their civil liberties. So it gets really tricky. We are not signatory, last I looked, to the ICC, which is now, going to theoretically try Putin if he ever gets captured.
Okay. Wow. So we are just a few days away from October 7th, where last year something absolutely horrible happened in the Israeli desert. And in fact, we do have viewers who are Jewish. So Happy New Year. I believe we are still in we're celebrating the Rosh Hashanah. So Mark, a situation like that, where you have a concert overrun by I guess combatants targeting civilians. Is that What is that? War crime? Well, it's not a war crime, right? Because at the time it wasn't war. But where does that fall? Something like that fall into? Clearly it's a crime against humanity, but does it have to be under the circumstances of war for it to be categorized as such?
armed conflict, and that's what the additional protocols do, is it extends it instead of between countries to things like attacks like that one. So,
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting because that means that so it is possible to commit a crime against humanity within your own country. And I understand Israel and Gaza, two different things. I'm not trying to say this one, but that just kind of that opens the door for it is possible, like Putin, for example, probably has committed crimes against humanity against the people whom he is supposed to govern, right? I mean, so that is an interesting kind of another just something to be aware of, that it is possible to commit a crime against humanity within your own population.
Absolutely. So, systematic racism. Notice I listed apartheid as a crime against humanity. So theoretically, de Klerk got South Africa out of apartheid, but Botha all the way back could be crimed under these things as crime against humanity, theoretically. So I've heard stories about President Bush being charged with crime against humanity, depending how you interpret it. Again, it goes back to the evidence. And then even like every crime, what's the intent? Right? So was the intent systematic and widespread? Was it to wipe out a whole group of people based on their religion, ethnicity? There are various levels and that you have to consider this.
Are there attorneys who specialize in this?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's also now the intersection between cyber and law of armed conflict. So if you're doing a cyber attack, at what point do you reach the threshold of violating the Geneva Convention? So using a cyber attack to take out the grid in Kiev, does that amount to a crime against humanity? So there's whole groups of people studying this. And in fact, we can even think an attack on what's labeled the domain reservé of a country. In other words, there are certain areas within every country, not just physical, but in terms of how the structure works, that are essential to the state functioning. For example, elections are critical to how our country functions, how our government functions. That's considered domain reservé. So recently I learned that way back in 2016, during the first run-up of election when Trump ran against Clinton, there's a story about Obama calling Putin saying, "We know what you're doing, stop it." I thought that was about just the disinformation that was going on in kind of the background, maybe not in collusion with Trump, but definitely in support of Trump. And I'd give a shout out to Dr. Jameson over at Penn, who did a great book on how that was used to suppress voting. But that was what Obama was referring to. What Obama was referring to is there is evidence that somehow Russian hackers had got into our election system. We got them out, but they were inside the boxes. And that's considered a violation of the domain reservé, which amounts to an act of war. So yeah, when you cross into the domain reservé in cyber, we talk about use of bellum, or at what point does the state have a right to defend itself? So the cyber world is now, there's this huge intersection that's emerging. But I don't want to get too complicated on this because it starts to boggle the mind on how difficult this can be.
I see that my colleague, Anara Tapushieva, has a question, so I'm going to yield the floor to her. But I do want to say I appreciate very much your comments about the Holocaust Museum and all of the genocide sins. I thought that was a really, really meaningful comment. All right. Anara, all yours.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. And I have a question about implication of the Ukrainian situation in Ukraine, and what global South can learn from Ukrainian experience, how to deal with war crimes, and how to record war crimes. And the second question, how Ukrainian case has expanded classification and assessment of the war crimes because some new forms of war crimes emerged. Or so at least we were actually, we heard about this. And that another question that bothers me, how modern technology in Europe changed the nature of war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's something new we can see today in this war between two European countries.
Yeah, those are really good questions. And let's start with the third question about how technology has changed.
Mhm.
If we go all the way back and think about what we were openly using it in 1949, we had naturally flamethrowers, which we just decided were out of bounds. But nobody ever thought about, and as much as I think nuclear weapons have kept the peace, the use of them could be viewed as a crime against humanity or even genocide, depending on how you read it. Definitely violates the principle of proportionality and humanity, and of proportionality. So as technology changes, and I think of like the Moab, the mother of all bombs, which could essentially is designed to be a bunker buster, whether that constitutes a crime against humanity if it's used against a civilian site. When I think about some of the things, some of the bombings, the question of using human shields during the Iraq War creates an interesting dilemma, is that do the US forces in Iraq have the right to get to the military target through the human shields? And then was Saddam guilty of using humans, guilty of a war crime for using people as human shields? So by the conventions, it's illegal to shield yourself in a hospital or with humans or with non-combatants, because you essentially have now turned them into legitimate targets by using them. So you yourself, by using them, are considered guilty of a war crime. Like you could ask the other two questions. I'm sorry, I didn't write them down. My mind wandered when I was answering the third question.
Mhm. Okay, the first question was, what Global South can learn from Ukrainian experience, how to deal with the war crimes and how to record all these crimes, because we see new experiences, new practices.
Yeah, what can we learn from the Ukrainian experience? Well, hopefully, the terms of the protocols and conventions are pretty consistently understood. The ICC and then the Hague have all kind of developed the ideas of what these mean. Again, the new realm is cyber, but I think one of the lessons coming out of Ukraine is how do we treat have we learned or how to treat leaders at the national level, be it generals or presidents of countries, which perpetuate war crimes. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Putin was in a country which was signatory to the Rome Statute and Geneva Conventions, and left him go. One of the things that we as the international community have to figure out is how do we hold people accountable without having to capture them or get the ultimate surrender? It's highly unlikely. I mean, the way we brought Nazi war criminals to trial was ultimately surrender. And then with Eichmann, we caught him off in Argentina, or not we, Israelis caught him in Argentina. Very few leaders, and Milosevic, Karadzic, were all captured and brought back to The Hague for trial. That's one area where we still have a lot to learn. Are there lessons learned from Ukraine? Yeah, we can actually see how they're going to manage, how they're going to manage the attacks on their grids by cyber again. That's one area where it's brand new. We don't know what to do with cyber yet. So we're learning. The other type of weaponry being used is pretty, I hate to say common. I mean, phosphorus bombs, we know that's illegal. We know it's a clear war crime. Indiscriminate bombings, by its very nature, war crime. So the area of growth for knowledge lies in one, how do we how do we handle cyber attack on the infrastructure? Two, then what do? We have yet to figure out how to hold people accountable. Unless we capture Putin or Russia surrenders and gives him over to us, Putin will go. He'll be convicted, or he'll be charged but never convicted and never imprisoned. That's just until we capture him. That's it. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very good answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. This was fascinating. I call for more questions from our moderators or viewers, please. I see no questions, but may I ask you something about, to tell us something about United Nations? Where are organizations like United Nations in the framework of those international laws that you described?
Well, although the ICC is there, it's separate from the United Nations. It can bring the charges as United Nations. They can bring charges up to it, and they can. The United Nations lays out the groundwork. We just had a long talk in my class about the UN as an institution and how its ability to, the fact that we all found a common need way back. We established the standards within the UN, within its bodies. Could it play a larger role in holding people accountable? Absolutely. The resolutions are useful in saying what went wrong. Don't forget, they also have great reach into the International Red Cross, Red Crescent, in getting aid out or getting inspectors or people to go off and inspect, or not inspect, but maintain standards within what we've agreed to under the conventions. So the UN has a significant role to play in all of this, naturally. So, yeah, Victor, I hope that answered your question. Again, the UN Charter lays out essentially just war, and that would even talk about whether Putin is even in violation of what we call the crime of aggression, which is not it's a form of war crime, but it actually precedes a war crime. We talk about two different things. Jus ad bellum, which is just war, and then jus in bello, which is how we actually handle ourselves in war. So by the book, Putin could be guilty of a crime of aggression, which is invading a country against what we consider the laws of what's just to go to war. So naturally, by the laws of what allows a country to go to war, war has to be the last resort. It has to be with the right intent. In other words, typically just to neutralize the threat against you is enough. And then second, it's declared by a rightful body. So either the UN Security Council can declare war, or in cases where a country feels that it needs to in self-defense, its government can declare war. But really, by the UN Charter, it really should be the Security Council that says, hey, you've exhausted all diplomatic possibilities. You have the right to attack, even though self-defense is the first line. You can do a preemptive attack if you feel that you're about to be attacked. And then the other element of that is the good of doing the invasion has to be greater than the bad that comes out of the invasion or the use of military force. And at that point, we then fall into, once you've made the attack, you fall under what is justified within the law of armed conflict, or jus in bello, how do you conduct yourself, which is what we talked about for the other half hour. So the UN plays a big role in deciding when, ideally, people can go to war. I mean, the UN doesn't leave out the possibility, or the UN Charter doesn't leave out the possibility that Yeah, that was an unjustifiable attack. And the one most recent is that I can remember where everybody agreed was Saddam's invasion of Kuwait back in 1991, 92, or 90. I forget what year that was. Security Council all agreed this is a clear violation of the UN Charter. And that was one instance. I think Korea was the other. I'm not sure if we kind of have a resolution for war on terror. I know we sought one to go to Afghanistan. I'm not sure if we ever got one. Eventually, we got one for Kosovo. I think we eventually had a UN resolution for Afghanistan as well, for ISAF. I may be speaking out of turn. I can't remember what the name of that resolution was, but I know we had one for Iraq, the first Iraq war, Korea, and also for the war, the later war on when we were in Kosovo as peacekeepers.
So from what I hear, I'm definitely not an expert, just a layman in this sense. From what I hear, since you have Security Council and Russia is one of the members of Security Council, there is no possible way that UN can condemn Russia as an aggressor.
No, not at all.
Because of,
Yeah, not at all.
Okay,
And you
so-
have to get China to go along with it too.
Wow.
so
That's interesting.
do you
the big
think
five
do you think this system has to be refurbished somehow?
Yeah,
It
that's been
definitely is not
talked about
working.
revising. Yeah, talk about revising what Security Council should look like. But if you look at who's on the UN Security Council, the big five, so Russia, Ukraine, I'm sorry, boy, did I misspeak there. Russia, the US, China, France, and England, essentially the victors of World War II. But each of those victors also has something very powerful in their back pocket that nobody wants anybody else to have, which is a nuclear weapon. So those five countries have the physical power to destroy humanity. So you want all five on board before you do anything drastic about invading one or the other, right? You want to have that safeguard. So I'm kind of on the fence about removing any of those five from the Security Council, or even allowing a majority vote instead of a unanimous vote of the five, because that could really endanger world peace for sure, if not humanity.
So this I will not go here into discussion, but it's clear to me at least that this allows a nuclear blackmail going forever.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's unfortunately the case. That's something that when we think about deterrence, whether we're allowing just the bluster of Russia of not and before we provide more aid to Ukraine, or even letting Ukraine into NATO. I'm not sure whether, again, we're off of war crimes and everything, but I'm not sure that if we don't call his bluff, we'll be forever blackmailed in regard to Russia. And somebody told me about, well, the likely ends in negotiated peace, and I look at that in terms of that amounts to appeasement, and that's probably the nastiest word to come out of World War II. It's right up there with genocide. Appeasing Hitler is what led him to keep going around Europe. Appeasing negotiated settlement with Putin could amount to be appeasement. I mean, so the international community is in a very bad situation regardless. If we negotiate, that's appeasement. That will make the Baltic states very nervous. Should make Poland very nervous as well. And with that, we look at a broader war. So, and that's probably worse. So,
Thank you, Katerina. You had
Just another
Okay.
practical question about war crimes. typically, does one have to wait to the end of the war, to the end of the event, to prosecute the crime? Can you prosecute war crimes while the event, the aggression is still going on?
Yeah, had they actually caught? I think he was on Mongolia where they let him go. He was then left. And Mongolia is a signatory to the Rome statutes and to the conventions. Theoretically, they could have caught him in Mongolia and tried him, sent him right to The Hague for prosecution. So you can capture somebody and try them while the countries are still at war. There's nothing to say that you can't do it.
Because the criteria for a war crime are not based on a specific country's definition; they are internationally recognized.
Right, they're internationally recognized, right? So you can cross the line of a war crime and be tried at any point before the war ends. I mean, typically, with the Balkans and Rwanda, they're after the conflict had ended and the international community established peace again. Then they started looking for all the war criminals around the Balkans and Rwanda, the ones that are most well known. So,
is there a statute of limitations on war crimes?
No, there's no statute of limitations on war crimes. There's no statute of limitations.
Is there anything strategic about pursuing war crimes now? Like for you, well, I might imagine the resources to do this. Like I imagine all hands are on deck just defending Ukraine. So, are we currently, is war crimes currently being prosecuted against the Russian armies?
No, not that I'm aware of. Not unless they're being prosecuted within Russia, which I doubt. I know that I think Israel's been charged, or Netanyahu's been charged with war crimes. I'm not sure if they brought up leaders of Hamas on war crimes yet. I know they brought up Netanyahu on war crimes. South Africa and somebody else brought up Netanyahu on war crimes. So
remind me, like, so does that, who makes, and so the international court makes the decision on whether or not someone's guilty of war crimes then?
yeah, they get a normal trial. They get a normal trial in The Hague. So yeah, the Milosevic, Karadzic, Mladic all got normal trials in The Hague. I think one of them, I forget which one, died in prison. But yeah, they have to be physically present, and you have to present evidence for and again, or for, and then the defense gets to present evidence saying that they're not guilty of the crime.
What if the country doesn't extradite them to The Hague?
That's a tricky situation. Can you go in like they did with Eichmann and capture them and bring them out? I guess theoretically you could, but we don't have an international police force that's going to do that. And if a country were to do it like Mossad did it with Eichmann, it creates a huge problem of relationships. I could imagine, because there are people, like I said, that consider George Bush II have committed war crimes. Imagine some country comes in and says, we're taking him back to The Hague for prosecution. They send a group of special forces in, grab him from his ranch. Yeah, imagine worse a case like that. I mean, how would we as the U.S. feel to make him snatched our ex-president?
Right, of course, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Even if I don't think there are any charges pending against him, but I know people talked about it. So, yeah,
Any like, it's a little bit off topic, but any remarkable events in Ukraine recently that have caught your attention in this horrible war? Any hopes or predictions for the near future as far as how things are going?
Well, I think I'm going to look more at the aid side, because right now I think Ukraine's more on the defense than the offense. And I look at the amount of aid that we keep promising. I think President Biden just offered some more aid to Ukraine. The Ukrainian military is doing wonderful with what it's got. But the West, for the most part, even without change of governments around Europe, unfortunately, most Europeans, except for those closest to Ukraine or those who've been under Soviet occupation, with the exception, I believe, of Bulgaria, are all, and Hungary, are, how do I put this? They want to support, but they don't support far enough that that will push Russia out. Everybody's afraid of the war getting out of hand and leading to a bigger war. The elections in East Germany, East Germany, there's a Freudian slip, in the eastern part of Germany, kind of ruled that. Public opinion in the eastern part of Germany is fear that anything more in aid will provoke Russia to a bigger conflict. And that's really why the AfD has been gaining so much power in the East. So,
terrifying times, absolutely terrifying times.
yeah, no, that Chinese proverb of may you live in interesting times, I kind of don't want to be so interesting. It makes life as a political scientist a lot of fun. I never always have something to talk about with my kids.
Job security, but well, thank you for thinking. Thank you for explaining these things. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's always fun to talk with you guys. I'm really happy with what Marshall's doing. I'm just amazed that after all these, it's going up on 3 years, unfortunately.
Sadly, unfortunately, yeah. We have one of our regular viewers, a good friend of our program, Leslie Titus, has his hands up. Leslie is a student at Marshall University. And Leslie, go ahead and ask your question.
All right. This may be a rather odd question, but have there been any individuals who have been tried or charged with war crimes who are not leaders of countries or even necessarily part of an actual military force, like, well, not just war crimes, but crimes against humanity, like, say, Timothy McVeigh, for an example. He wasn't part of an organized group that was trying to carry out an attack, but he basically carried out a terrorist attack that killed a large number of civilians. So if you were doing that in war, it would pretty clearly count as a war crime. But has there been any attempt to charge individuals in that way with a war crime or a crime against humanity?
That's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question to ask the terror where they fall in. Yeah, it's a great question, Leslie.
Yeah, again, Timothy, thank you, Leslie. It is a really cool question. It kind of draws out the distinction that Timothy McVeigh, as an example, when he did that, he committed ultimately murder, right? When he blew up the Oklahoma City, what was the name of the building? It was the federal building.
I think it was just the Oklahoma City Federal Building.
Yeah, no, there's a name for it. I can't remember the name of it.
Morrow?
But yes, yeah, something along those lines. I'm sorry. I'm sure I'll get like panned for not remember the name of that crazy federal building. But yeah, that was actually, you could say who is a member of an insurgent group. I don't think he was. I think it was just him and his partner. As an insurgent group, it would have been a terrorist attack. It's murder. Terrorism is murder, and how you count it. I mean, terrorism is anything which violates the person or the personhood of anybody is either is a crime of some type, which is really where we distinguish between a combatant and a terrorist. So a murder is an act of terrorism, but he did clearly an act of terrorism, is clearly murder. He was tried internally, so he was never taken out of the country. Let's take, for example, Osama bin Laden. Could he have been tried for a war crime? Absolutely. He could have been taken back to The Hague and tried for planning the attacks on the Twin Towers, or at least encouraging attacks on the Twin Towers. Abu Zubaydah, could he be tried for war crimes? Yeah, probably. He could be tried. He planned it. Could the 9/11 bombers be tried for war crimes? If they claim that they're part of an insurgent group, did they kill unnecessarily? Did they use unnecessary force? Absolutely. But terrorism, it remains a crime. So whether you get prosecuted locally or abroad, The only ones I know have been taken back to the ICC are people that were military that have not been prosecuted in their homes. In some ways, you lose your protection to kill. If you're military, you're told you're supposed to kill by the laws, right? But you lose those protections when you violate the law. Does that make sense, Leslie? In the same way, as a civilian, as an insurgent, you're allowed to carry weapons as long as at some point you expose them. We think about the, I don't know whether to call them guerrillas or freedom fighters in South Vietnam. They couldn't walk around the streets, but at some point they had to declare themselves. They too can't kill civilians unnecessarily. So I'll take a crazy example out of what is it? That song by Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams, where the Viet Cong blow up the little cafe. That's a crime against humanity, or at least a war crime, because you kill innocent people. Now the Viet Cong could argue, yeah, but there were American soldiers in there. They're also off duty. The Red Army, when they blew up the Berlin cafe way back in the 80s, well before you were born, act of terrorism. I could go back all the way to think about the Munich massacre, war crime, but that predates the additional protocols. So very good question, though.
Thanks.
Thanks, Leslie.
You're welcome.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, Victor, should we move on to kind of concluding our program for today? Mark, I want to thank you so much for this presentation, for coming back, for talking about this very important topic and educating us all a little bit more on these various terms, thoughts, principles, ideas. And thank you for helping us apply it to this current situation. Victor, anything?
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. This was very enlightening, and I hope we'll have a lot of viewers of this program. Thank you for coming back to our program.
You're welcome.
We're running for 100. Yes, we're here for 136 weeks, and we're not stopping.
I applaud you for that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Frey, please say a few words to our Ukrainian viewers as usual.
Thank you. Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці до наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Героям слава!